Hello everyone, today we talk about Davidian Scotland. I will of course avoid to use the dramatically terrifying term revolution which has been attached to the general development of Scotland during David I's reign, where, as you know, between 1124 and 1153. This can serve as an introduction to this period of Scottish history, including what I hope to discuss at some point, in fact, David's reign. At the same time, this video is actually part of the historical region series in a sort of unspecific way. We'll probably not even go into that playlist, because it is mostly about the historiographical concept of the, in fact, Davidian development, Davidian reign, or so dreadfully known as the Davidian Revolution, which of course was not a revolution of any kind, and like also the term itself does not make sense. It's not that the period is not important or that David did not have actually a great role, in fact, in the development and expansion of his country, especially of its monarchy, right? And so a nascent Scottish state. Just recently I made a video about medieval Scottish warfare in sort of a broader chronological span that, however, does include critically the 12th century at the moment of greater rise properly of a Kingdom of Scotland under different points of view. So we will hopefully also make more videos about Scottish history, about British history more in general. I think Schwerpunkt lacks comparatively good foundations in British history, say, compared to what, of course, I deliberately increased a bit as a content, meaning the continental one, especially the post-Carolingian area. In any case, this is deeply connected with it. I mean, the entire concept of this, let's say, this period, like the idea of Davidian Scotland, does stem from the connections that Scotland particularly intensified during David I's reign. Mostly through England, because that's actually the point, even if there is a broader Scottish connection. We've seen it also in the aforementioned video, for example, with imports of weapons from, for example, from Germany, connections, as we will see today, with Flanders, with France, and not only with the most propelling part of Europe, also the relations with Ireland were quite strong, for example, at this point. There is indeed the import of some essentially foreign models, right, institutions that, however, at the time were quite unspecifically national in that regard, and mostly pertaining to the broader feudal monarchical development that Western Europe was going under in a very strong and pronounced way, right? And that especially the Anglo-Normans were the some of the more, at least some of the harshest affirmationists, if we can point out in this way, meaning that they were actually very successful at that. There is some more recent historiography that says, the myth that the Normans were so efficient, especially in England, is a bit of a myth, etc. That this may be true in many ways, but it's not much about the Normans that were actually just like importing, in fact, some of the finest Western Frankish, in fact, the most advanced Western European models at that point, rather the nature of Britain, which is a bit the same reason why Scotland, as we've seen also in the video about warfare, had been lagging behind for all the historical reasons, say, more distant from civilization, less resources, and all what comes from this that we will also observe today. Were we to make the long story short, David's accomplishments have to do with, in fact, in this sense, the implementation of these models, mostly with what, of course, and this is the most important part of the story, had already come to be available in Scotland, like having the substance, but at this point needing to give it a form, right? Because it's not that David invented this stuff out of nothing in terms of, nor he would have been able to establish these systems hadn't Scotland already matured, right, the preconditions for it. So we're talking about the Boers, right? so as you know, essentially a commune, right, a town or town in Scottish. The development, the further development of Gregorian reformistic communities, rules, infrastructure in Scotland, that we will see what consisted specifically in the foundation of monasteries. Importantly, now they were patronized by the same king. In a sense, the normalization of the Scottish government unavoidably. We will look at some point in David's life what his youth especially had been about. He had been raised at the English court when he was a kid, and he sort of had to be re-Gaelicized once he came to rule after various succession steps, from other relatives, etc., into his native land. And in general, the introduction of feudalism that came mostly through the volition of the rulers of this time in affirming some more robust military clienteles, the possibility of co-opting them, and again subsuming this very powerful military resources that were quickly advancing, mostly a privatistic system that, however, now required some greater authority to regulate and to also glue together to a degree. It's obvious today we will not talk too much about warfare. It's something that perhaps I will make in a distinct video. I'm preparing a series of sort of more in-depth military analysis than the usual, that to use as specials, essentially, that perhaps also we look exactly at these sort of takes, because we do not have sort of absolute categorical quantities about this efforts and how, say, the Scottish military developed at this time, but we have indicators here and there. Not much really changed, right? The reason why, as I was saying before, the term revolution, it's just like fireworks for the mentally feeble, is that, of course, everything was already developing gradually, in the case of Scotland even more so, from quite a while, and the formulas, the substance was always the same, right? The clienteling systems had already been part of the Scottish, even the Pictish system. This is not really. It's about the establishment, the further development of the Kingdom of Alba, and the way the Scottish monarchs could reassert their control, also in various parts of the land. For example, David reclaimed at some point great parts of the north, also parts of Britain that were technically Norse rather than Gaelic. There were wars. Also, there was the important Battle of the Standard, was a Scottish defeat, but that also was not particularly tragic. There is an heavy interference of David into northern England, and not just militarily speaking, but in terms of ecclesiastical ambitions, right? And we'll see what this was about. There is no doubt also that David's reign was heavily dependent on the Anglo-Norman kings, especially Henry the First. Scotland can be legitimately seen as a sort of English client state at this point in history. And as we'll see, much of David's effort was sort of to emancipate the same country from the Anglo-Norman rule, right, by essentially imitating the English and in that autonomous, soundly founded capacity of monarchic power, fundamentally. And there is no doubt that David was one of the most important rulers and sort of accomplishers in the history of his realm. Were we also to assess very concretely how, or what he did in a sort of unitary, comprehensive sense, we can appreciate essentially the king's capacity to foster different allies, to co-opt, to also to threaten, to subdue, because Scotland was not even technically a unitary real. Like there were even sub-monarchies still to some degree, and David essentially made his best essentially to strengthen his allies, his subordinates, through a series of clienteles, of also external support, the foundation of the new institutions, and therefore to make the traditional basis of Scottish powers more stable. Right, so it's not about, I don't know, some hardcore reform or whatever. It is all, it's something overall very important, but that if you take individually sort of fits like the general tempers of the time, so that there is technically nothing specific about the Davidian revolution, if you want. And in fact, the term revolution in itself is just a pain in the behind just to pronounce. In the first place, because of this sort of, I don't know, emotionalistic, impressivistic nonsense that alienates people ever more from the reality of history, which is something that in today's times, especially, we're ever more severed from. In any case, and this is the point that historiography has correctly pointed out, as it's obvious, telling the truth, that, of course, the expansion of Scotland during the 12th century, think about the concept of the 12th century Renaissance, right, is part of a wider European expansion that, in the case of Scotland especially, was fed from some of the northern French and western German core, but also like fostering the connections with Rome, having also having just an international status recognized through prerogatives and privileges. There is some of this that the Scots will develop as a nation for a very long time before reaching a truly and fully international like sort of sense of peerage with the rest of Europe, especially with England, right, as a monarchy, right? It's not before the Wars of Independence or even certain proclamations from the side of the Scottish monarchy will witness to that. There's no doubt that Scotland was the periphery of Europe, was fundamentally backwards, underdeveloped, and it had not really received some of the finest inputs, if not in terms of civilizational development, but the Norse had been quite predatory, had been even, in fact, concurrent and conflictual against the development of the same Scottish monarchy. Made a video about the Battle of Largs. The territorial unity of Scotland at this point is sort of very, very far, and the same foundation of the kingdom in the lowlands was already, like, it had been launched admittedly, but the same concept of the Scottish lowlands in their primacy, like in the right of governing over the rest of the country, were only at this point being clearly defined. The 12th century in general, like in Europe, is characterized by a tumultuous, brutal growth, right? It's not yet orderly, it's dangerous. This is the great century of heresies. This will not actually touch Scotland more than much, because most of those were probably in some of the most developed areas, ironically. But there's also, for example, a different spirituality, like the Gaelic world, as you know, had developed in a slightly different way from, let's say, from the Roman model. This was not as evident in Scotland as in Ireland, for example, but there were significant, say, diversions that, as we will see, David would try to correct, particularly in the administrative model of the country, centering like the diocese in a city proper rather than in a monastery, right? It had been normally the practice of the Gaelic church, simply because these areas had never really had much of real cities up to this point. Little detail about this, of course. The Normans again had changed a big deal. The Anglo-Saxons had already actually contributed to the civilization of Scotland, the assertion actually of the same English preeminence in Britain from quite a while. I made a video about the Battle of Brunanburh that is quite eloquent about that, but it's really the Normans that, as you know, sort of put an end to the so-called Viking era and stabilize Britain, even as far as, sort of interfering with, but not oppressing Scotland, but also in this sense giving it sort of a stronger backbone politically, institutionally. The Metus Hostilis is always a great civilizational booster in many ways. Naturally, it's different to describe Scottish history in comparison to, for example, the English one without an adequate background to highlight these differences. But what you can see still under Mael Coluim, that is Malcolm the Third, like the David's father, King of Scotland between 1058 and 1093, gets down to the clanic nature of Scottish history. That's something that we're sort of more acquainted with in a broader cultural sense, right? The capacity of establishing a true status as far as, for example, having a fully independent church, right? At least in comparison to the one of other countries, and obviously under the Pope, the papal monarchy at this point, but a real administrative system that works in a also cohesive way, and as a consequence reflecting a truly centralized royal government by those times standards, right? The capacity of the monarchy to really oversee all these movements, like fostering them, further helping stabilizing this, also in a strictly military sense, like the deterrent necessary to make communities work peacefully to a degree. This was really difficult to achieve in 12th century Scotland. Consider this were people from the generation of, David had been born in 1084, right? So yes, these were after the Norman invasion, was a completely different Britain from before, and David was very updated as far as his Normanization at the English court was concerned. But again, the native land was really different, and with unevenly distributed resources and quarreling clans, and all what you can imagine in this regard. So even what we could think is something so basic as having, conventionally written documents of any sort, right? Or having a native coinage system, like with mints controlled stably by the sovereign, etc. Like even having merchant towns as a net that could interconnect the country and also project it a bit, like even overseas. This all together with infrastructure that could be even fostered privately, like having castles where having a control in the surrounding estates in an orderly way to provide with effectively and collectively trained, heavily armored cavalrymen. All this, right, was something that Britain was first witnessing with the Anglo-Norman invasion, and that the Celtic French had to cope with the brutal way, also internally speaking, in struggles of power. Again, this video is not about David's reign. That is quite complex in many ways, especially the first part is connections with Henry of England, with Stephen of Blois. Like this is all. His niece was Empress Matilda. Just to make, like, we're talking about very sort of high-level connections with the Anglo-Norman world, right? But also in times of trouble for the same Kingdom of England that was ravaged by, as you know, the succession, especially after the wrecking of the White Ship, and all that really messed up abundantly, like what had starting instead without tremendous footing, like in terms of a unitary English monarchy, could have, in that sense, stabilized much stronger connections even with Scotland, even probably at some point subsumed it. Like, this is not like something you have to bet on necessarily, but let's say take away a couple of barons' wars in England, and surely you would have had there some sort of more respectable power, not just in France, but also by reflection in the north, right? So we can say that all the aforementioned sort what we listed before as Scottish deficiencies were fundamentally gapped during David's reign. At least the premises, the foundation of all these institutions were effectively launched by this ruler. Needless to say, there was a greater internationalization of Scotland, strong ties with continental Europe. There's a Gaelic matrix that, of course, remains always. Scotland always maintains it for reasons of necessity. Scottish realm works according to its own law and its own internal mechanisms that are as archaic as primitive, do contribute to this monarchical development as well. Right? Probably David was like a bit more felt, probably even horrified by certain mechanisms that that were required to have him fully recognized as King of the Scots, for that matter, by the local nobility, having himself been brought out at the Anglo-Norman court. So he would understand the difference, but that's a plus because he was really knowing what could be achieved, and he worked relentlessly in his life to have further, improvements, were not novelties, enacted. All right. The Gregorian forms are a very important background in which to interpret David's policy for a number of reasons that are not just like what he was able to introduce in Scotland, but the pressure that his country was under by the influence, the interference of the Anglo-Normans. Right. The Gregorian reforms, we made lots of videos about that, had stressed a need for discipline, right? Homogenization, order, hierarchy, like all the best, of course, of Western civilization, as far as the unitary spirit of a Catholic tradition was concerned. And basically all the other peoples who had not, by this point, in Europe, managed to achieve that important standard of like having cities, right, with a lay and ecclesiastical authority, interconnected, in fact, at the Western level, and capable of producing further resources for expanding, etc., were seen legitimately as backwards and sort of the targets of further expansion. Now, the Gaelic world was overall of Christian, of course, but also of old Christianization. So the problem, for example, of let's say having to face crusades or whatever was not really present in this context. Yes, there had been some clashes. I mean, the same conquest of England was technically a crusade, but there were different degrees of this. Like, of course, the Gaelic French never sort of underwent, in spite of the brutal and systematic subjugation by the side of the Anglo-Normans, like anything like was happening in the Baltic, right? Nor, of course, to the levels of intensity of the Reconquista or the Outremer, right? The point, though, is that given that the English, the Anglo-Saxons, had really thought this since the beginning, really of their settlement in Britain, really believed that the Celtic French belonged to them by imperial right of conquest, because that's, if you want, like I think a great part, at least, of Anglo-Saxon identity, and that's something that they had earned. I mean, the Anglo-Saxons had really proven, historically, civilizationally, culturally, that they were the strongest. They were to hegemonize the British Isles. There's no doubt about this. The Scots, the Irish Gaels seemed like the most favored target for the of the English overlordship at this point, as technically the English, and this is not the video to explain it, had really sort of made some steps to further affirm. And the ecclesiastical matter was quite stringent in this sense, because technically England had been Christianized even after Ireland, Scotland. Yes, there were imperfections in some ways, but historically, again, the Celtic Fringe had its own ecclesiastical administration. It had surely maintained itself more backwards by this point and sort of less functional, in a qualitative sense, than the rest of Roman Catholic Europe. And this was used as an excuse, also one of the points that the English royal court used to make regarding the necessity of civilizing these Celtic barbarians, right? The Gaelic monks often called the Shelley dead, that is the Chaldees, basically, like sort of in their ascetic way of life, had been pioneering from the Celtic Fringe, also contributing to the evangelization of Europe. Their own kind, like of spirituality, they had founded also their own monastic houses, but paradoxically mostly on the continent than in the same Celtic Fringe, where the resources were really scarce, and actually part of their spirituality and their actually rigid and violent asceticism, their rules were notoriously brutal and sort of to the limits of physical torture, had contributed to instill, in fact, that part of spirit of even of resistance that was put against the attempts of further interference in a way or another. Naturally, also this video is not necessarily designed to describe the differences between Scotland and Ireland. The former was surely much ahead in the construction of anything resembling like a kingdom. The Irish would never quite really have anything of this kind, at least in a de facto and functional way. In any case, when the Gregorian reforms had kicked in, and all Western Christendom, which all, of course, these communities faithfully depended on without any doubt or attempt to sneak out, especially the elite had seen the opportunity that enacting these reforms at down at the local level would have entailed for the boosting of the same lay power, right? For example, Muirchertach O'Brien, ruler, let's say High King of Ireland, self-declared. He was actually King of Munster, but later self-declared, as we were saying, like just by wishful thinking, High King of Ireland, ruling between 1075 and 1086 or something. Toir de held back more Concob higher, who had been the same, except he was King of Connacht and ruling between 1119 and 1156. Also Edgar Mac Mael Coluim, that had been King of Scotland from 1097 to 1107, and the same Alexander the First had been King of Scotland between 1107 and 1124, and was the grandfather of David the First, had began to support, to enact properly the Gregorian reforms in their country with, again, limited result. There was also historically like a connection, as we were just saying, between Scotland and Ireland in matters that went even beyond like the single local government. The same Scotland had taken the name from essentially what were called the Irish were called. There had been always strong connections for obvious just reasons of proximity and essential ethnic similarity, if not homogeneity, and their general role in relation to England that was surely providing with that, again, expansionistic example also as far as the Gregorian reforms enactment was concerned, sort of helped even to connect, to cooperate in at the levels that could avoid like the English claiming some further dominance on their country. Now, this did not depend just on the ecclesiastical reforms. You know, Ireland was sort of far west in very different ways from Scotland. Again, it was more compact, right, in a unitary direction. And there are some cultural implications. For example, Saint Malachy, right? That was the Archbishop of Armagh, made recently a video about the Irish ecclesiastical hierarchy, would cooperate with David I across the sea. There was surely a Gaelic phase that was as, let's say, relevant in a cultural direction as the Anglo-Norman one, as far as also the ecclesiastical identity was concerned. And there was also a great interest from the same Gaelic world to simply get the best means from, in a purely cultural sense, from continental Europe, and so from bypassing England in that medium and sort of dominant function over the British Isles. David's predecessor, Macbethad mac Findleach, also known as the Red King, ruling between 1040 and 1057 as King of the Scots. This was the Earl of Moray. We'll see how this was relevant for David's reign also later. Had spent himself, for example, for hiring, right, and hosting Norman mercenaries, even before the Normans would conquer England, right? So exploiting, as we've seen, that wide movement of adventurers that came in a broader sense from Western Europe and that were starting to roam around, in part as a continuation of the Viking era, but in this sense mostly probably from the strongest bulk of continental Europe, and in this fanatically as traumatically violent as effective mounted elite that, especially as foreign elements, could be extremely loyal to the local kings, and so containing and counterbalancing the ethnic nobility, even though we should point out that there were still Gaelic war bands that were settled in Scotland by this point, say from Ireland. There was still surely also a Norse connection. Again, these were not fully peaceful or cooperational issues because, especially with the Normans, but I mean from everybody around, because this also for the Gaelic side, like the piratic activity, for example, was quite intense. Like it was more like, okay, we will settle, right, wherever, right, and also in a conflictual sense, very often. But there were, like, for example, the House of Stuart had allegedly been established in the very northwestern corner of England from the Norman conquest. If I'm not wrong, apparently a Brittonic heritage, which is also incidentally Gaelic in that regard. So, like everything, right, in terms of especially the Anglo-Scottish borders, was very, very dynamic and fluid. There had been also major monarchic issues. I mean, the St. David, as we've seen, had been fostered at the English court because it was in exile. The same English exiles had, let's say, we're talking the Anglo-Saxons here instead, after the Norman conquest, had fled in part to the courts of both Colwyn III and the Third de Halbach, who had Brian as the High King of Ireland, and we've seen this also in the recent video about the Varangian Guard and others we made regarding how this Anglo-Saxon diaspora that partially occurred after the Norman invasion. The settlement of military retinues was enacted under David's rule, mostly through the newly updated and sort of legally defined vassalitic beneficiary relations that were proper of the Western Frankish world that the St. Normans had come from. It's not that like the Scottish knights at this point hadn't had like a similar relation, but first of all, as we've seen the other day, Scotland had less of a military elite in a quantitative sense compared to the other countries, because the surplus was scarcer, and so also the hierarchy down to, I don't know how these guys were equipped, was more defective compared to the best standards of the West, but they would compensate with the larger sort of levy. Like the Scottish army had lots of infantrymen, even though also in Scotland, of course, cavalry was had been gaining superiority historically. Like also the Picts had important mounted forces. Scotland always had, as down to Caledonian times, like an important equestrian elite, but just contained in the more orderly, properly feudal, monarchical statal direction that, say, the Anglo-Normans could enjoy after the conquest of Britain, but even just by the means like the dukes of Normandy as vassals of the Western Frankish king, right? This went together with the dispersal and installation of royal agents in the Scottish territory, the establishments of new mots. Also in here, nothing revolutionary. The Scots kept building. Like there is an enormous debate actually just for England regarding say what was like a Norman influence or not. Too much pages wasted for something practically useless, right? Yes, there are some important archaeological considerations you can make historically. Like, we know certain things about this, but let's say the way fortifications evolved had the same gradual relevance that the local changes could do. That were very slow, especially in a country like Scotland. So even if the Normans could bring something more updated, it's not that from one day to another, like especially in Scotland, it was not subordinated to them, at least directly controlled by the Normans. There would be magically castles popping up in a radically different way. Very importantly, more importantly, in some sense, the newly created staff of sheriffs with judiciary functions had been affirming. During the same time, law enforcement could be possible, and if you had specific officials that you could support militarily speaking, endowing them with enough resources to have, in fact, law respected. So there is no doubt the Anglo-Normans represented also for Scotland like a great change, like in Britain. And these systems were sort of imitated. There was a direct model, etc., but also the way they could be enacted and their effectiveness, right, in an absolute sense, we do not know, and we presume having been substantially gradual. There was surely a lot of experimentation in governmental practice in the first place. One very important aspect of this naturally got down to the identity of the monarchy, right? Up to this point, you can argue that hadn't quite been a Scottish dynastic law, right? David's reign seems to have strengthened this, together with the prerogatives that the king had as far as, for example, controlling the military clienteles and just like requiring the military service under the king's banners. All right, so castle building, the regular use of these military professionals, things like knights' fees, homage, fealty. It's something that starts kicking in this otherwise more primitive and habitudinarily the disconnected Gaelic reality, and with, again, strong assertion of the same monarch over the local powers as well. There were campaigns where some rebellious noblemen broke down. There was the reaffirmation of control on territories that, say, the King of Norway was still seeing as, in part obviously because they were mostly populated by Norse men like their own. So there is an important stand that David makes internationally at this point. There is a connection, of course, also with the, for example, Western Frankish houses that, as you know, even after the conquest of England and the settlement somewhere on the Anglo-Scottish frontier, if not in Scotland even, would mostly see Britain like the B series kind of reality. They had their center in France that was much more advanced, rich, important, whatever. And in fact, this is a frontier area helps, in a sense, the Scots, because there are sort of more individual knights, some of the most desperate adventurers. Really, the most desperate ones went to Ireland, right, for that matter. But with Scotland, you could receive some of these, and starting gradually from some pockets to settle them, to concentrate power, say, against this other oligarch and clan noblemen, etc., and going by that. Naturally, these knights would, as vassals, sort of entrench over the generations their own personal, say prerogatives dynastically, but they were also impositively established to an extent that had helped to sort of co-opt them and to assert themselves, allowing indirectly the king to sort of control through them larger parts of the country, and under, like, against the probably an official recognition that their role there was legally determined as vassals of the king, and so conferring to the monarchy a greater authority and importance and sort of public relevance, also as far as if another knight wanted to be settled, like this looking at these privileges, more would like to be settled, and so more important people were likely to come and to connect the king with some higher power, and that's how the thing used to happen. All right, this went with, of course, the obvious establishment of different lordships of sort of smaller scale, feudally speaking. One example would be Freskin, right? That was a Flemish nobleman settling in Scotland under David's reign, becoming the progenitor of the Murray and Sutherland families, as well as others. By the way, these times are very archaic. There was in Britain in the later centuries at some point like a hunt to we can date back our ancestry to the Norman conquest. This makes it so better, so cooler. Some of these legends are made up, of course, but the process did happen, right? And you see here from people from Flanders that, as you know, had constituted a consistent part of the Norman invasion force, together with the Bretons, as we were saying before. The Freskin, by the way, Freskin's name emerges in a charter of David's grandson, King William the Lion, who reigned from 1165 to 1214. And the deal was that essentially Freskin's son being given by William Strathbrock in West Lothian, and Duffus, Kintray, and other lands in Moray, that, according to the document, this act of William the First, King of the Scots, had been held by his father in the time of King David. So we know that indirectly, and you realize that these lordships had not existed before under this lineage, at least in that there was, by the end of the 12th, the beginning of the 13th century, like an important recognition that David had just knowledge. We come to discover this through these acts, but that at the time were notorious, really having been established under David. And Freskin was not an exception, by the way. There were lots of Flemish settlers in the mid-decades of the 12th century to be found in West Lothian, in the valley of the Clyde, right? Freskin built a castle in the distant territory of Moray, and since he had no specific ties to the place, this made him much more dependent on David. As we were saying before, you do not know anyone here. There is an aristocracy that, of course, doesn't quite like this foreigner settled there, and especially because it's backed by the king that is trying to assert his own authority there. But exactly for this as well, makes things more complicated for them to counter, right? So it's through these guys that were used as literally military colonists to some degree against the same parts of the same Scottish establishment that, in fact, violently, the Scottish royal authority could extend, right? And this, again, Freskin is just an example of the many, right? For example, David, we will see it at some point, defeated Angus of Moray. That was the last king of this area. That had existed as a title from the 10th century, right? It's say Moray is what is now northeastern Scotland. He died in 1130, and essentially his power was annulled by David, who thus allowed these. We don't know whether Freskin was exactly like a product of this outcome, but surely he can fit the context quite plausibly, right? So we're talking again ruthless policies, but that's also what governments at some point must enact if they want to do anything in a non-consensual way, because they may be limited by whatever the locals believe to be their prerogatives. Now, the government of Scotland as a whole, this was really the issue in many ways, that is much more important than whichever mechanical means were enacted. The good old politics and war worked together with society. Needless to say, David would have envisaged some characters of Anglo-Norman England to be transplanted, or at least adapted to the Scottish situation by his work. Right. The royal demand through the sheriffs was now better administered, better controlled. There is a sort of core land of effective public territory that it becomes de facto like the king, like in other kingdoms, the ruler's possessions, right? It's the king's as such public land, but it's used as just any other seigneury that also the other noblemen have, right? Among these territories, we can enumerate Roxburgh, right? That is a civil parish, and it had been, in fact, a royal burgh in the Scottish borders. Scone, the town in Perth and Kinross. Berwick upon Tweed, also known as Berwick on Tweed, or simply Berwick, in Northumberland, England. As a matter of fact, again, the frontier would oscillate at some point. Stirling, right? I made a video explaining a bit also the geography of the place about the famous battle. We are some, I don't know, I think like 40 kilometers northeast of Glasgow, right? And Perth, right on the banks of the River Tay. The justiciarship, which is the English form for the medieval term, say medieval Latin justitiarius or justitiarius, the say the king's chief minister, if you want, was established in Scotland by David. These were created with proper sees in Scotland proper, and one for Lothian, that is the region of the Scottish lowlands lying between the Southern Shore, the Firth of Forth, and the Lammermuir Hills as well, and the Moorfoot ones, that is properly the districts of Scotland north of the River Forth and the Scotland south of the same, and east of Galloway in the southwest of Scotland, with the historic counties Wigtownshire and Kirkcudbrightshire. Naturally, this institution was very similar to the Anglo-Norman one existing with the justiciar and the sheriffs, and the Scots had not been stranger to like similar institutions. After all, had always been some sort of public legal representatives, etc. So this practice is not just created ex novo, but simply strengthened, boosted further by the monarchy, by essentially endowing these guys with sort of more power, as we've seen just like with other clients. We see, for example, the More Mayor, that is the Earl fundamentally, Constantine of Fife, was appointed Iudex Magnus, right? So the great judge, the great Brehon, right? And the Justiciar of Scotia, that was as such the most senior legal office in this period of the Scottish history, was thus more like a sort of Gaelic office that was Normanized with some modifications, but fundamentally just already a thing historically. Let's say one of the most important needs of a monarchy, as we were saying before, is an independent mint of some sort. In order to do this, you also must accumulate enough precious metals with which attracting like the say your own clientels, making stick around and representing in fact the standard out there, just also for the other powers to see, right? And a crucial role is played in this by the silver mines of Alston, a town in Westmoreland, and Furness in Cumbria, England, right? But that at the time was controlled by David, who managed, in fact, to issue his own coinage and strengthening his royal power as well as economical penetration across the country. There were some economic policies, such as like regulating, in fact, the precious metal exchange in the country. There was at this point an imminent increase in the general availabilities of the elite, right? For example, you see luxury and also exotic commodities being more likely in use by the Scottish nobility. There was also more, say, a steadier mean of payment for all those who wanted to be in the service of the king. And again, this is what attracts also better people that does compete with one another, increasing the quality of what the king can afford to pay. Numismatic iconography aims at propagandizing royal power that is depicted in majesty, and it's also getting to be known by his people through these means. I mean, that's something, sometimes you may not think, but think about Louis XVI, that was recognized allegedly when he was captured while he was trying to escape France after the revolution through a coin. Right, that's just an anecdote, but the idea that people, of course, wouldn't know necessarily how their sovereign would look at some point, even the money like circulating, showing his image, right? That's something relevant, in as much as these coins really move, really travel, they're issued, they're spent, they do have precious metal. And this was a very important mean of propaganda at the time, aside from the strictly, like, whatever the moneyers, the lenders, the merchants would know about finance. Even in this world was fairly, again, getting just acquainted to that scale of monetary traffic, right? And that evidently had now the means, however, to fully distribute, to integrate that. This favored, of course, lots of aspects, like to monetization. You can help the development of towns. You can have also law more, enacted more easily, because you can monetize certain goods from the penalties, etc. The same charters help, let's say, defining better how much quantities are involved and how much does money is needed. So this is a very interesting aspect of this the same commercial development of Europe and of Scotland, that, as we were saying before, starts witnessing an important phenomenon of town foundation and expansion. David, from his marriage to Maud, the Countess of Huntingdon, Matilda de Senlis, essentially. She was the great niece of William the Conqueror, right, and the granddaughter of the Earl Siward. Allowed through the dower, of course, the capacity of the king to finance the construction of what have been defined as the first true towns in Scotland. Right, Scotland had, again, been a pretty savage, wild land up to this point. It had a very old and fascinating history of fortification. Now it was starting to open, even just psychologically, in a less sort of paranoid way of clanic feuds, etc., towards something more extensive, structured, like more hierarchical in nature. Right, the same towns helped in turn to for the development of other villages, for example, and so on. When David was Prince of the Cumbrians, which again is something we will see in another video as just a part of his life, he founded what are recorded as the first two boroughs of Scotland. They are the aforementioned Roxburgh and Berwick. The best way to do so, as you know, we've seen it often in this Northern European context, also in the video about the Hanseatic League. These are some of the same years, right? Scotland doesn't have a strong commercial potential, but the best way to start like these towns was guaranteeing trading rights to the local communities that obviously pre-existed, so that it's also a political thing, that they're sort of communes in their own small regard, right? And also the very concrete material reason why these specific centers would be conferred these privileges was, of course, like the fact that we're first of all located in a strategic position for the monarchy to access them, and when there, the king was had all like a privilege, like in the choice, probably in the etymological sense, to collect and sell certain products in there as a essentially as a hospitality measure. Like this is just like the Faldrum in other contexts. When of course Scotland had similar things before, but not specifically connected with the towns to this degree. Essentially, these centers conferred the king's logistical support. When he passed, he would have, of course, he would entertain relations with the local establishment, which would get something in exchange, would be co-opted, and so these guys would supply the king, would provide him with the means, say, for his army, for his expeditions, and the towns were obviously like some certain centers of stockage of just supply, preservation, production, and they could greatly help without being so aggressive individually, also as the nobility, actually countering the latter as well, because they were sort of more communal powers, and again they were not structured in a unitary military sense just per se, even though of course the locals had their own levies, militias, etc. When David became King of Scotland, he founded more of these towns. Before 1135, we know that 4 more boroughs had been established, and specifically in that part of land that was, let's say, outside of Cumbria, so like extensively in Scotland. Here I inserted some images. Right, there are, for example, the royal burghs with castles were Edinburgh, Berwick, Roxburgh. The latter two were in the south. Like Edinburgh was, as you know, as Glasgow, as we will see now, to rise as the most important centre in Scotland. But Stirling, Perth, Elgin, these were all royal boroughs with castles. Right. Without castles, you have Lanark, Peebles, Haddington, Dunfermline, Llinglich, Gow. I forgot. Yes, Montrose, Aberdeen, Forres. Right. Then you have boroughs founded by other characters, king's vassals, David's ones, such as Renfrew. I forgot Rutherglen for the royal boroughs without castles, but then you have Canongate, is basically Edinburgh. St Andrews, we will see now, in part the centers for other reasons, right? So it was important just to like dot the land. It's also in the more, like essentially here we are in the lowlands, for the facilitation of royal logistics, the one of the vassals, like connecting more the land, which was just, even in terms of communications, like a quite important thing for the traffics, etc. Right. And we know that around 15 boroughs were founded in David's reign, but we do not know how many others, because some may have not even developed further. We do not know, like to this day, that they were established even as royal boroughs, right? But surely was part of a broader dynamic of naturally pre-existing centers. Not really, these places were not created just by scratch, all right? This helped dramatically Scottish economy, all right? William of Newburgh wrote during the king of William, aforementioned William the Lion, that also the Gaelicization of Scotland had benefited from this, because in part the foundation of these boroughs had helped fostering a sense of Scottishness of some sort, and some English speakers had been persecuted as a consequence, right? And the author speaks of this exactly in the towns, because of course there would be Englishmen in this Scottish borough since the beginning, right? And the idea properly of the Scottish Islands in a political, cultural sense stems fundamentally from, of course, like some previous development that had occurred in the more open grounds, fertile areas, the better served by also like the sea axis, given the more prosperous interland, etc. Through these foundations that strengthen again the connection in this region, right? We've seen it in the video about the Hanseatic League's connections with Scotland as well. Again, scarce because they say there wasn't such a huge market in the land in the first place, but the establishment of jurisdictional licensed communities at ancient royal centers and even at new sites that are connected with, especially the latter, with the eastern seaboard of Scotland, is definitely an indicator that the country was sort of opening also to international trade, right? The North Sea was still pretty dynamic at this point. The Viking era had ended, but let's say that it's not that the Norse had ever left, also especially in a commercial sense. And also, like, the Scottish output was not just irrelevant, right? When you look at both crop and chattels, you realize that the local harvest was enough to sustain some important economy, and the growth of the same boroughs in the first place, right, with some surplus and more, right? There were, for everybody who just sailed along the Scottish coast, there were custom dues, like whenever these vessels took berth in the harbors, like you could exact some toll, and further growing in wealth. And you know, the larger the harbor, the more active the local community, and sort of the more attractive it was in the first place. Speaking of the religious reforms of David I, here is where arguably like the greatest successes occurred. Right, at some point, David suffered military reversals. For example, mentioned the Battle of the Standard was not much of an issue because like it was not meant to crush Scotland in that defeat, nor the Scots stopped their military activities besieging some castles on the frontier, exploiting the civil war in England, etc. Monastic patronage is one of the most important duties of a 12th century sovereign. In many ways, we've seen it, for example, for the Iberian monarchs, that in order to connect themselves ever more with the post-Carolingian world, they start patronizing Saint Cluny. They really spend a lot of resources, like for foundations, were outside even of their kingdom's boundary, to establish some sort of high-level relations with other peoples. And of course, for Scotland to have, especially an autonomous, when not independent church from England, and therefore a direct connection with the papacy, was a way to see its status consolidated internationally and receiving more help whenever problems would have arisen with its neighbors, right? David, as you know, by the way, is a saint, right? He is celebrated by the Catholic Church on May the 24th, and we will not talk about this because it's something also, of course, occurred after his life mostly, and the point being, though, that he was apparently a pious ruler. Of course, behind his monastic patronage there was a great deal of political wisdom and capacity, especially. In 1113, when David began his rule as Prince of the Cumbrians, we have his foundation of the Kelso Abbey. That is also where he had his main residence at the time. In 1144, David, together with the Bishop John of Glasgow, prompted the Kelso abbey to found a daughter house, that is the Lesmahagow Priory, located in the anonymous centre in the area of South Lanarkshire in Scotland. David continued, by the way, his grandfather's patronage of the Augustinians, following the rule of Saint Augustine, that were part of these various congregations emerging in this time. I made a video explaining this white mantles of churches. Right now, this was the original one, and because several orders of friars would have this ways, but sort of the most famous order is the one founded in 1244. These were before, of course. So there were, again, you understand, fostering also different relations with different orders, different branches, was a way to connect with different nets at the same time. You could, because these congregations at some point were enormous, right? So by connection with multiple ones, just you would have such an enormous support from other parts of Europe. Because say somebody invaded your land and somebody destroyed one of these abbeys, just out of the regular devastations, it would be some sort of general issue that the system would have in other countries and so on. So it was a way to, again, glue together Europe as well. The support of the Augustinians brought to the foundation by David of Holyrood Abbey in Edinburgh, right? It's also like a ruined one today. It would develop in the later Middle Ages into a residence. These abbey was founded with the monks from the Merton Priory that had been founded in 1114 by, like we're talking an English Augustinian priory, by Gilbert Norman, Sheriff of Surrey, under Henry I. So here the connection also with the Kingdom of England, and again David's protector. The same David and Bishop John also established Yatburgh Abbey in the Scottish borders, with canons coming from the northeastern city of Beauvais in 1138. It was the department, so sort of close to Paris, at least located in one of the most intensively connected centers to the French monarchy. These monks, these canons, would be sometimes like randomly chosen, like there was some blessing of the local authorities, etc., but it was mostly just having someone from also nearby places and good places like northern France in terms of general cultural development to bring to Scotland in the first place. We know of other Davidian Augustinian foundations, such as St. Andrew's Cathedral Priory in St. Andrews, in fact 5, Scotland. This was founded by David and the Bishop of Scone, Robert of St. Andrews, in 1140. In turn, you have the St. Serb's Inch Priory, Loch Leven, founded sometime between 1150 and 53. That we find another foundation yet of the Augustinian monastery of Cambus Kenneth, right? That was established in 1143 with canons taken from Arwezem, yet another northern French center of probably that would be also the founding canonical one of the, in fact, Arwesian order, that was famous around those years, like especially like in the 30s of the 12th century. So again, we don't have time to digress on this. Perhaps we will make other videos on how these orders, these congregations really worked, but as you understand, there was a lot of spontaneity, and especially the 12th century, like these are popping up like mushrooms, right? The most important Davidian connection was, however, the one with the Cistercian order, was sort of the gold standard of hard work, like properly land exploitation, new forms of like management of technology, etc. Because these guys thought like really that, you know, the world had been reordered according to this community through hard work, etc. So it was a very active congregation. They also say bred the war horses for the crusaders in the Holy Land. They exported the animals outre-mer. So it was really, as you know, the most powerful, the most rampant order of the time, which led to the foundation in 1137 or 6 of St. Mary's Abbey in Melrose, right, Roxburghshire, in the Scottish borders. This time the monks were from Ribble, that was a Cistercian abbey near Helmsley in North Yorkshire. And as we will see, the issues were important, like because okay, we'll talk about the bishopric issue later, right? But the Melrose Abbey was to become the greatest medieval monastic establishment in Scotland, south of the River Forth. It is from this abbey that David established the new battle one in Mid Lothian, in the east central lowlands, the Kinloss one in the county of Moray, the Holmcultram one in Cumberland. So again, as you understand, an incredible monastic fostering. This is also why, again, David won a sanctity to some extent, aside from his pious ways. That were all one in, if you read the historians of the time, actually, with the sense that he had managed it by still imposing royal authority on the rebel barons and things like that. So the iron-fisted policy going perfectly in parallel with this righteous moral direction as well, and this is the essence of the imperial Catholic tradition for that matter. And the Benedictines, that had been until the 11th century practically the only order, like in that still any other order was still technically thinking to be, and just having re-edited St. Benedict's rule, were patronized by David, like it had happened under his grandfather Alexander already. Benedictine monks were introduced to Coldingham, that was a non-monastic property of the Durham Priory. It was a Benedictine one associated with the Durham Cathedral in northeast of England. Coldingham is a village and parish in Scottish borders on Scotland's southeast coastline near Eyemouth. So this territory was, as you understand, pretty close, and so the finest foundations in Scotland were, in fact, quite connected with the northern English one, the ones of Yorkshire, and we will see how important this was for the ecclesiastical hierarchy in Scotland. Naturally, David was not the only person founding monasteries out there. For example, the Order of Canons Regular of Premontre, known as the Premonstrants, and yet another known as the Norbertines, and in Britain and Ireland as the White Canons, were helped, were patronized by Hugh the Morville of Appleby in Westmoreland, with the foundation of a house for them, that is the Dryburgh Abbey. We are in 1150, right? And this is located on the banks of the River Tweed, right, in the Scottish borders. 1150 is just like around there, like there is this legend that the agreement occurred in November of the same year. But important being that you have powerful enough noblemen that are, Hugh Morville would be the hereditary constable of Scotland, by the way. It was yet another Norman knight who made his fortune in the service of David I. All right, and so you have there some broader blessing, of course, by the monarchy. By the way, in 1143 you have the foundation of a Cistercian abbey from Rievaulx, the Dundrennan one, near to Kirk Dubride, by the sub-king Fergus of Galloway, which it's also like these are all abandoned, but this one is a masterpiece of Romanesque architectural style in, again, an area that was not particularly more advanced of Europe, right? And also in this case, Fergus was supported by David I, and with this connection from Yorkshire, right? And we are told later on by the Florentine merchant and politician Francesco Balducci Pegolotti, who lived between the 13th and the first, at the end of the 13th and the first half of the 14th century, that the Dundrennan Abbey would become the most powerful landowner in both Galloway and Ireland, right? And the Italians at the time, from their sort of mercantile financial background, that's why they would know mostly about these areas, in that with that interest for them to write these things down for us to know, is quite telling about the factual power of this area, of this abbey, which under the the local rulers was of course a way to control like the part of the western Scottish seaboard that, as you know, was not essentially one of the single most controlled parts of the country. Needless to say, all these injection of not just of investments, but literally of single French or English monks that were literate, right, and thus could help to serve the crown growing administration, was quite useful for the same Scottish government. The Augustinians were quite involved, like because of also the older connection with the monarchy. In this, the Cistercians were mostly specializing, as we said before, in the new land exploitation practices and techniques, right? And Scotland was really considered like as a frontier, right? The Cistercians had this mindset getting on. Okay, that's a fringe area, it's a frontier. There is new land to deforest, to reclaim. Let's go there and do it, right? So this helped dramatically Scottish economy for those time standards, where people just coming to work on these lands owned by the abbeys, the monasteries. So, as we've seen before, like this could give rise even to some of the most powerful seigneuries locally, right? And without considering, of course, the enormous spiritual activity that traditionally these centers were just called to perform. Like there was all an ideology spreading about naturally the necessity of the monarchy, the importance of the hierarchy, like that was embodied, of course, in a heavenly sense by the same monastic order and rules and so on. So this was really relevant. You have Scottish wool starting to become in parallel one of the most important in Northern Europe, right, as far as the exports were concerned. So again, Scotland would not be a particularly developed country compared to the rest of Western Europe, but what was happening from the within in relative terms was really, really amazing. Now, ecclesiastical affairs were, however, a much more serious deal when we talk about the ecclesiastical hierarchy proper. All right. When David was ruling the Principality of Cumbria, he appointed his chaplain, John, that was one of the Tyrannensian clerics, and that in fact David had met during his participation in Henry's of England conquest of Normandy after 1106, in the various issues of the House of Normandy, as Bishop of Glasgow, right? John was surely very updated in terms of Gregorian reforms of the general idea of the papal monarchy and all what was supporting, in fact, the reinforcement of a Scottish monarchic rule, a Scottish, ecclesiastical autonomy, like all the opportunities that would arise for the church and also for himself from this. David was very careful in the way he proceeded to establish this new episcopal administration, because at that time, as we've seen, he was ruling the Principality of Cumbria, and essentially he made, first of all, an inquest regarding the appurtenances of the, say, as we will see now, especially of the Bishop of St. Andrews, that already owned some lands within the principality, and he gave all the remainder to the new bishopric of Glasgow, right? And this was very important because he didn't want to create attrition within the same Scotland by giving lands that belonged to somebody else, especially to the church, because here this is a relevant matter. Like lay rulers were meant to sort of to protect the church and to make it develop the way, of course, the church that was independent, technically not even an earthly power, so completely disconnected from the lay who organize as they so fit. And the land attributed to the Bishop of Glasgow was enough, right, to sustain this bishopric, and in fact would Levi would become the second most important one in the kingdom. And by the 20s of the 12th century, David worked to build an adequate cathedral for the episcopate. It was important given the nature also of the Scottish clergy, and that was still very private-minded and seigneurially oriented, to maintain, to protect the independence of not just the bishopric of Glasgow, that was evidently like his own creation, and so supporting the monarchy especially in that connection, but also the other ones that were created, right? And this was triggering essentially a reaction in England, because historically the Archbishop of Canterbury as well as the one of York had historically claimed metropolitic overlordship over Scotland. This is something we haven't seen much on Farpunkt. I discussed this, if I'm not wrong, in the video about Edgar, but I'm not sure. We should try to make a video about this. Canterbury was sort of the spiritual center of England, of course. York had been historically important because it just was in Northumbria, like the other, say, Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo world, let's say that, sort of retain important connections also with the Celtic lands, with the Norse world, and so on. So the fact that David would found these bishoprics equated to saying something like, I'm creating a church on my own in Scotland, and by creating all these bishoprics without actually asking for your opinion or acting like as if we were cooperating, I am essentially establishing an autonomous church on my own, right, for my own kingdom, for Scotland, that even though at this point was in fact not recognized as independent from England, was de facto becoming one, right? And as we will see, actually at least the English at this point did not have the capacity to simply overrun Scotland and to simply impose the rule. So actually during David's reign, as we've seen, there were multiple invasions of England also carried out on behalf of the various parties that were fighting in England. So it's sort of complicated. The Scots occupied some of these lands in Yorkshire, and it was mostly the latter that was concerned about claiming overlordship over certain other parts of Scotland. As we've seen, by the way, these monks, these canons that had in part, we've seen with Ribot, like they had been quite into the same fostering of a Scottish clergy, because they thought that this would end up like historically under their own control from York, right? But this wouldn't quite be the case, all right? And the Scottish Church organization is fascinating under David, because there's been a historiographical debate also about how much did, let's say, the Scottish Church, properly the ecclesiastical administration, say the parochial system, the episcopal sees, like down to the districtuation of the church, owed to David technically. And at least there was a time in which this Davidian contribution was overrated. Of course, Scotland already had an ecclesiastical organization. David did move the bishopric of Mortlach, that is Dufftown, in Moray, east to the new borough of Aberdeen, for example. He arranged the creation of the Diocese of Caithness in the very north of the country. That was essentially a Norse province that was brought under Scottish control thanks to the military expeditions of David himself. And these lands were properly provided with a episcopal administration that they didn't have, they hadn't had before, right? So in that sense, David did create those churches. But when we look at the lowlands, no, right? That's a completely different story. The bishopric of Glasgow was simply reorganized, sort of restored, restructured in some sense. So you have rather a resurrection of what it's just like along the pattern of the Gregorian reforms. Like the canons existed, the various communities had historically arranged in different ways, and at this point you have just the need to make everything more homogeneous and more functional, right? Which is another story. We see the Bishop of Whithorn that was greatly aided in the years before David's reign by Thurstan of Bayeux, that was the Archbishop of York, and this with an evident Anglo-Saxon influence, and with the cooperation of Fergus of Galloway in a previous time, as well as the cleric Gil Alden of Whithorn, right? That was a native Galwegian, admittedly, but that helped the revitalization of the local episcopate in Scotland. So there was lots of stuff going on at the Anglo-Scottish border, also cooperatively with the church, mostly because the Archbishop of York thought that land, especially the lowlands, were so close, would just fall under their his metropolitic authority. Aelred of Ribot, an English Cistercian monk, wrote in the elegy to David that when the sovereign came to power, he found 3 or 4 bishops in the entirety of the Scottish realm, and he's actually talking about north of the Forth, all right? And when he died, after having, led, like having behaved pastorally, like and morally, like as if he had a spiritual power in the same church, he had left 9. Both of ancient bishoprics, which he himself had restored, and new ones that he had erected himself. All right, it's a famous quote. And you understand how, in all the, you can imagine what the big late 11th, early 12th century Scotland technically was, right? So these bishoprics were important. They had historically existed, but they were at times abandoned. Even they would lack at a point maybe the resources. Other times they sort of had to, that they were damaged, as we've seen. So it would have been normal at some point for a strong sovereign to say, okay, here was an ecclesiastical community. There is a basis. There are some pre-existing traditions, customs, etc. Let's refound it from here. It would be completely reasonable and advantageous. All right. There was also another aspect that I pointed out at the beginning regarding the, let's say, westernization, if we can so say, of the Romanization, let's put it this way, of certain Celtic practices as far as the permanence. This was typically Scottish, in the Irish sense rather, that, as you know, and this in part had remained, think about Canterbury itself, in Britain, that as much as it had at some point been evangelized by the same Celtic monks, the idea that since the British Isles were not particularly urbanized, and thus the diocesan system was not quite the one of the continent founded in the city, that monasteries would act as dioceses in some way. In Scotland, there was a sort of hybrid, at least in some places. For example, Brecon, Dunkeld, Mortlach, in Aberdeen and Dublin were all forced, at least by David, to become fully episcopal centers, right? So entering in the Roman system of a centralized diocesan administration from the specific centers that they already had some connection with in the first place, but had that now were uniformed according to the Scottish national basis that was the Roman Catholic system, and all informed by the Gregorian diktat, right? The same Scottish parochial system, we may think, was benefiting from this uniformity, but it was not reformed, let's say, was not established proper by some Davidian policy specifically. Scotland had always had that, and that was pretty much it, right? Since the early Middle Ages, and this, there is no doubt that the Anglo-Norman influence was that powerful and relevant, but on the other hand, say we can be sure that the Scots had already their own church organized in a way that could in fact sustain in the first place such further say full reintegration administratively in the Gregorian temper, and that by the standards that now the Reformed Church had upheld. All right. So Scotland starts aligning ever more with the feudal monarchic style of England and France, that are obviously the most powerful influences, especially as far as probably the state building is concerned. And so, like, I know it's sort of hard to make these videos without, like, if you do not know at least the, say, David's reign, like listening to them may be somewhat confusing, but in general, like, since I think the Davidian revolution is somehow taught in, you know, at least in British schools for sure, but in general, like, it's like an important phenomenon in British history, I thought to approach it from the general overall side of the story, and then we will look more in depth at David's reign. That is also quite, you know, it's really interesting also from a military point of view, and it has many, you know, it is within the general dynamics that we have seen also for other contexts, more or less at the same time. But it's something you have always to appreciate also in the specificities of this system. Like, well, what did the Gaelic system differ from, like, say, from the Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo-Norman one? All right, it's an important aspect of the story, considering especially the Davidian reforms, if we can so call them, started from the single most also Normanized areas of the same Scotland. Right, we've seen there were Englishmen as well contributing to it and just living in the same places. So it's that's something we have to appreciate in some better form or another. For today, however, I stop it here. We have again to make a bit more of British history, and I think starting like more, we should make more English stuff for sure, but this is like a start, like for every, as you understand, it's intertwined anyway. And for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.